Today we will be discussing dual relationship issues in rural areas. First, let's start off by defining what exactly a dual relationship is. Erickson defines a dual relationship in the mental health field as a multiple role being of be it of personal or business related, extending outside of the confines of a counselor-client relationship. Now, in looking at the American Counseling Association Code of Ethics, there are specific sections that are geared towards dual relationships and how a counselor is to govern him or herself in that arena. In Section A5D, entitled Friends and Family, the Code of Ethics states that counselors are prohibited from engaging in counseling relationships with friends or family members in which their objectivity will be obscured. Also, in Section A6A, entitled Previous Relationships, the counselor is encouraged to examine the risks that go along with entering into a non-sexual or romantic dual relationship. And then lastly, in Section A6B, Extending Counseling Boundaries, the counselor is advised to again consider the risks and to make sure that the overall well-being of the client is of your main concern. So in just reading that, we can see that the Code of Ethics does concede to there being a possibility of dual relationships and does give us somewhat of a framework to work around or to work in as far as how to navigate dual relationships should we come in contact with one as counselors. However, what still remains to be seen is the address of this topic in rural areas and how common dual relationships are in rural communities. So as we begin to look into the research, there was actually quite a few studies out that specifically targeted dual relationships in rural areas and how exactly counselors are to navigate these murky waters. So let's start off first with what we come to find was the mentality of the rural community and how it kind of inherently opposes the Code of Ethics. Warren and Bryant found that there was a three-part belief problem in the rural community when it came to a counselor trying to strictly adhere to the confines of the codes of ethics in regards to multiple roles. The first part of the belief problem was accessibility. Access to proper mental health services are limited in rural communities, and so this must be taken into consideration. Say for instance, if you are a counselor who is very well involved in the community, so obviously there are other hats that you wear besides counselor, and if one of the individuals in the community comes to you for service, if there is only your practice within the community, then it's highly likely that you will engage in multiple roles as being the only mental health service provider in the immediate area. The second belief problem is availability. Warren and Bryant noted that 85% of mental health professional shortages occur in rural communities. The third belief problem, and is probably the most crucial, is acceptability. Community members are less receptive of receiving help from someone that they do not know. This in and of itself really opposes the codes of ethics of abstaining from dual relationships. And such is the mentality of rural communities. you gain your clientele as a member of a rural community based off of who knows you, who can attest to your reputation. And so this creates quite the conundrum for a mental health professional who is trying to establish clientele, or either trying to determine whether or not to take on a client, as the client is more than likely going to come to this person because they might have known who your mother was, or where you went to high school, or things of that nature. So let's just dive into some of the research that I found in particular. There was a research done by Shank and Scavolt, and it was called the Minnesota Research Study. And the purpose of this study, it was a qualitative research study to ascertain the issues of dual relationships in rural communities. And so they gathered 81 participants who were Minnesota or members of the Minnesota Psychological Association. So just a bit about the demographics of the individuals that participated in the study. They all practice in 15 small communities within Minnesota. 4 were in community mental health centers, 16 of them were in private practice, and 1 was in a multidisciplinary group practice, and then the last one was in a hospital. Of them, they had an average of 13.9 years of mental health experience. To note, no one had any coursework or training specific to practicing in rural areas. And so basically the setup of the study was first to conduct a questionnaire in which all 81 participants did complete a questionnaire, and then as well as there was a one-on-one interview. Only 16 individuals participated in the interview portion of the study. So what they did with the data is they just collected it, and they really divided the answers according to themes. And the most common things that the data seemed to bring back was reality of overlapping social relationships, reality of overlapping business and professional relationships, as well as the overlap of the counselors' family members and clients that they see. And so when they completed the questionnaire, what the researchers found was that for the 16 individuals who completed the one-on-one interview, every single participant counselor had been in a dual relationship. So as we can see, it's almost unavoidable when you're in a rural community. However, what the counselors stated were their ways of trying to navigate the balance between just their counselor hat or forging into multiple roles, is that they based it really on 3 criteria. And this was, firstly, the counselor's personal comfort level. How comfortable were they to forge on into a multiple role, whatever that may be. Secondly was the client's request, taking into consideration the client's needs and what they felt comfortable with after things were fully explained to them. And then lastly, the severity of the presenting issue. If it was an issue that would require extended sessions over a long period of time, then it was the general consensus that many of the counselors just refused to enter into that role. So what the counselors reported back was that they saw that if they really controlled the kind of multiple relationship it was, this had a better effect for the dual relationship, as well as protecting the client from any type of exploitation, versus how many times they entered into a multiple relationship. So it was really quality over quantity. What they did know is that in being in a rural community, you have to find a balance between flexibility as a counselor and possibly entering multiple roles, and then also a counselor who adheres to your disciplines, standards, and codes of ethics. But in order to be a competent clinician, you actually need to have your finger on the pulse of the community, which means you do have to be involved to a certain extent to know the culture of the community, the demographic, how best you can service their needs. And so what certain individuals within the study noted is that you have to develop a skill of being able to compartmentalize and to be able to put people in a role at a given time, and to know that when you're not in that setting, that the same rules don't apply. But all in all, what they did come to the understanding was that it was just not something that they could avoid. And so it would do better to really iron out the parameters of the relationship. Of course, get informed consent, consult with your supervisor and colleagues, as well as to document. As for implications for practice, dual relationships are likely to happen, and in some cases are unavoidable, as I've stated before. It's also noted that there are presently no trainings offered specifically to target multiple relationships in rural areas. So that is something that you would want to take in consideration as you choose your demographic and your location to decide where it is that you want to practice. That training at this point in time is not offered to really solidify something for counselors to help you figure out, what specifically are the parameters for foraging into dual relationships, if you should. Also, counselors will have to use their code of ethics as well as their values to establish boundaries, but maintain flexibility with the needs of the community. So as I had stated earlier, you will have to find what works best for you as an individual counselor within your given community, as a way to stay in touch with your community, to know exactly what systemic issues an individual may face within that community, but be able to maintain enough of a boundary that you are not violating your code of ethics. And then lastly, counselors will need to create a voice for the issue of dual relationships in rural areas, and lobby for more attention to be addressed in future revisions of the codes of ethics. And we will turn it over to Lois.